Hello, everyone, and especially to our world travelers. I hope you got some sleep last night. Jet lag? Great to have you here. It's fitting that we're meeting here today at the end of this project and also at the end of what I believe is the International Water for Life decade, 2005 to 2015. And I am looking forward to hearing reports about the impact of that decade, and I hope that half of them are about women. Let's have some fair representation in research. This presentation, and I have a wonderful co-author named Marlene Stearns, who, like me, has an anthropological heart, but she's in Peru. And we tried to Skype her in so that she could give the middle part of the presentation, which is really about her research, but we couldn't get her. So thanks for trying. First, we look at some social science research, and I'll move through that really quickly because that's kind of boring. The second section provides insights from women agribusiness leaders in Africa. So I'm taking you even further away, but the lessons are important. And about how water quality and water supply affects women's work as agribusiness leaders. Where's my forward? I got it. So we call our paper Vital Connections. We emphasize 3 vital connections, and women are part of all of them. Women and water, women and food, women, water, and food. As Marcus said, you can't just look one sector at a time. You've got to cross sectors, but women have to be there all the time. We're convinced that a lack of connected research, policy, and programs hinders progress in gender equality and empowerment. It hinders progress in water security and food security, and more widely, local, regional, and international peace and security. It's all connected. Around the world, women and girls are responsible, as our initial speaker, Daniel Rosenberg, said, for the delivery end at the household level of water for food, drinking, bathing, and hygiene, and for clean clothes. I mean, you all know how important it is if your kids are going out to the mosque or the church that they've got to have clean clothes and when they go to school. Women farmers also often depend on irrigation water. Women are farmers and producers as well as bathers of babies and cooks. In situations of water insecurity, this responsibility often leads at the individual level to what anthropologists and sociologists call water stress, a very different usage from what Marcus uses. For us, it's a kind of anxiety, and just like anxiety and stress that we may experience, it can be moderate or extreme, chronic, or in and out, and it has to do with the fact that if you're responsible for putting the food on the family's table, if you're responsible for the kids' clean clothes, and you have complete dependency on either piped-in water that gets turned on or off at different times of day, and you expected to be able to get some water for cooking, and you paid your water fee, and you can't get it, you become anxious because you're not fulfilling the expected role that you're supposed to do and that you feel proud about when you're doing it right. So it's so iconic to say, oh, it's so horrible for women to walk to a public well, it's so far away and it could be dangerous. But at least if it's public and it's clean water and they know they can get there, they have somewhat more agency in getting that water than when water becomes privatized and they have to pay for it, and it may be piped in and out at undependable times. Beyond water stress of that sort, which you may not know as much about, there's obviously all the biological afflictions caused by contaminated water. In fact, girls and women who provide water to their households could in fact be providing poisoned water to their families because that's all they have access to, arsenic and other terrible things in it. Is this slide 4? Local, regional, and state-to-state water policy is male-dominated around the world. I can't think of a single place where women are in charge of water at any or all levels. If you know of an example, email me. And most men do not experience what it is like to be at the household end of the water supply system. They can yell at their wives if there's no water, but they normally don't go out and get it. Have you heard of water brides? It's an interesting case, and I can't remember where it is. I think it's somewhere in India where men marry multiple wives to carry water, and they're actually called water brides, so that men who have money can get water carriers as wives. This is not empowerment. Around the world, again, authoritative knowledge, knowledge with power about and bureaucratic control and management of water lie in the male-controlled domains of agriculture, business, engineering, and technology. Access to clean and dependable water is a classic case of something about us without us. You've all heard that phrase, right? And it's going on in Paris. It's something about us without us. Women do not have an equal place at the table for climate talks or peace talks. So we are responsible for something. Women are at the supply end of two critical resources, water and food, but largely excluded from government and governance, local, national, and global, that makes decisions affecting what they can access at the community and household level. Patriarchal, bureaucratic, and professional structures in land rights and irrigation block gender equality, while some policies, programs, and projects seek to address such underlying gender inequality, most ignore it and seek instead to work around it, but rarely with success in the most patriarchal contexts, including parts of Central Asia and northwestern India, which I argue is still more patriarchal than southern and eastern India. A case study of the Department of Irrigation in Nepal found that in spite of a policy to require that all irrigation management committees have 33% women members, is that 50? That's 33. That's kind of the typical kind of liberal cutoff. Let's go for 33 and say that's equal. 3 years after the policy, only 4 districts in Nepal had 20% or more women members. Since the 1990s, progress has been made toward mainstreaming women, no pun, in water management and policy. Studies increasingly indicate the positive effects of women-inclusive and women-led water management. Some studies critique what they call a nominal success. Yes, you have more women numbers in water management, but not enough to create a so-called tipping point, and people think 33% is that. But again, we don't want to essentialize women. You can have some women on committees, but they think like men, and you could have some men on committees that think like women. Wouldn't that be nice? There's all sort of intellectual transgendering going on here. So there's just not enough in most cases. So it can be a nominal success, but I would argue that at least go for nominal success. Get the women in there, get a different face on things, even if they're outnumbered and maybe having committee stress. Next slide. So we're going to connect some of the dots here, women, water, and food, moving beyond various things. Researchers in many fields have looked separately at the two areas, women and water, women and food. I mean, it's a lot to handle in either case, and doing two is twice as hard. Scientists in hydrology, agronomy, and engineering follow the same pattern. Their ministries are separate around the world, and although probably there are some attempts, and maybe successful ones, to cross those boundaries, it's hard. The water-food sectoral division is clearly evident, this is a killer, by looking at the studies in each area. For example, Marlene and I compiled an annotated bibliography of sources, written sources, on women's agribusiness involvement around the world, including Canada. The compilation includes over 80 sources. So, thinking about this paper, I did a key term search in that bibliography for the word water. You want to guess how many times it showed up? One time. I was amazed. It's just amazing. I think that's some kind of data. We acknowledge the central importance of water in this conference, but we wish to connect water, Marlene Stearns and I, with food production in this presentation. We actually have some data. Case studies show that when women head food businesses, they insist on having access to clean water. They know it's important in reaching their sustainable business goals. This equally important question is, are women entrepreneurs who have water security more likely to start and or succeed in agribusiness? We're going to work on answering that question in years to come, I think. Case study research conducted by Marlene Stearns when she was on a Fulbright grant of 10 women agribusiness leaders in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. It's described in a Global Gender Program working paper that you can access for free online. Tells what these women, 10 women leaders do. She interviewed them and asked them what do they do and how did each of them get to be a business leader? producing good food. The case studies are fantastic. Through this case study research, we're learning that women business leaders are better stewards of natural resources than men because they prioritize the provision of higher quality care, water, food, health for their families and communities than their husbands do, because they're the front line. In 2015, Marlene Stearns founded the Women's Food Leadership Initiative, a nonprofit organization. Its goal is to increase the number of women leaders in the food and agricultural sectors of the Global South by featuring their businesses in formal business case studies and promoting their impact on food security, environment, and communities through media and events. So for this presentation, we went back to the women leaders and asked them about their water use, just 4 or 5 little questions. So this is just a slide showing you how important it is that women food leaders do increase food security and are good stewards. And this is an informational slide in case you're interested to see how we define what is an agribusiness. So this is the slide that starts bringing in some of the quotations from the women. Through her company, Ecopia, Mitzlal of Ethiopia has trained over 11,000 farmers, men and women, to better manage the natural resources they have to improve sustainable farm production of safe and healthy products. She has a scholarship for women studying food safety and processing at a university in Ethiopia. She's a women food leader. Women are not just field laborers, they are influential drivers of change through business, science, and policy, creating new systems of food that meet their needs. Problem is, we only see the laborers. The leaders have gone unrecognized for too long. There are more of them all the time, like Catherine Krobo, who is from Ghana. And we also had a conference a month or so ago and brought in all these women food leaders, and they were sitting here too and having a wonderful time. I think then here is, I wish Marlene Stearns were here. She knows these women so much. Happiness Osalebe is also a woman food leader who works on various kinds of projects that you can see there on the slide. How am I doing for time? I'm going to stay within my time frame. Do I get a prize? Oh, Marlene wanted this slide in here because I asked her, what is a borehole? Do you know what is a borehole? Yeah, and apparently people, in our study at least, prefer boreholes to other situations, and it's beyond my expertise. Boreholes and wells. Here's Dina from Malawi. What slide number am I on? Can you tell? I've lost my, the 5 women food leaders who replied to the short survey preferred drilled boreholes, for their water supply because it's a more reliable supply of clean water and has the least contamination from human activities. Women are willing to pay for clean water. This is how important it is to them, their families, and their food security. This is the case with the successful agribusiness women in Africa interviewed for the case studies. They aren't setting out to change gender power relations themselves. They are setting out to improve food systems that are not meeting their needs or their standards. Since the installation of a drilled borehole with an electric pump, community subscriptions to electricity have increased. So another cross-sectoral thing that we need to take account of. This is the group who came here a month or so ago and sat in this same room and presented on panels. And Marlene Stearns commented that although she invited men to be speakers on our panels, none accepted. And she said it was actually a good thing. She said the women seemed much more comfortable talking to each other without men around. But of course we don't have a control. We can't sort of say. But it seemed wonderful, and they were happy to talk to each other, and they had so much to share by bringing them together. It's honestly, it was my first conference ever with real people, like you all, rather than academics, practitioners, and folks like us. Summary points. Studies suggest that existing social networks among men prevailed in the formation of water user associations, as men contacted men and they kept their control. Women may not often have such associations, but Marlene and we discovered that none of these women leaders were parts of associations. They did it on their own. They must have in common, and I think many of them do, husbands. They were married, and the husbands were supportive. So this is like a policy thing. Make sure husbands are supportive of women. I don't know how we can do that. Just marry good men, right? Make sure it's in the job description.
Or make them good.
In fact, none of the women who responded to our survey belong to water associations or many networking associations at all. So these are my summary points. I think just kind of came up with it. They make common sense to me. Yes, then they're huge goals, and it may take a long time. Women should be included in substantial numbers at all levels of water decision making, and they should have, we don't quite know how to define this, they should have women's interests in mind, which mean good quality water and food for families and not using community resources for things like wars. We've got to bridge the gap between water policy and programs and food policy and programs, and keep working on that, even though the ministries may be separate and the knowledge bases are separate. It's a challenge. Assure that knowledge of cultural and social practices informs technical expertise in water and food ministries and research organizations. And I'll tell you, it's an uphill battle. A lot of the technocrats do not want to hear from us because we make their life miserable and messy, and we tell them about bad things more often than telling them how things can work better by using our knowledge. So Marlene and I want to keep building the Women Food Leaders case study. We want to start a kind of like Harvard business case study, only it would be women agribusiness leaders. And Marlene has formed an NGO that GGP is helping to support, and keep sharing the knowledge of what works and why what women do works better than maybe what men do through educational institutions and the Women Food Leaders Network. So thank you all for listening. And Marlene Stearns, I wish you were here.
All right, so we started a little bit late, so I think we have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has some questions to ask, we have somebody right here. Yeah. Wait for the microphone.
Спасибо за очень интересные презентации. Я хочу вопрос задавать госпоже Дипи. Она пример приводила соглашение между Индостаном и Пакистаном на территории Кашмир. Мне было очень интересно узнать, что за соглашение, можно ли применить, чтобы другие страны изучили, как они смогли добиться соглашения, что этот опыт, как может, что за соглашение.
Thank you very much. So my question is to Ms. Olapali. So it was a really interesting presentation of yours on the agreement between India and Pakistan. So the question is whether this can be applicable to Central Asia in any way. Do you think there are any lessons for Central Asian countries?
And I'm gonna say we're gonna take a few questions first and then answer them at the end. So.
Thank you. Sébastien Pérouse, Central Asia Program here at George Washington University. I have two questions, maybe to Marlene and maybe also to Marcus, who has an excellent overview of the world, on the water issues in the world. I mean, talking about the water management and water issues in Central Asia, it seems to me that probably one of the main mistakes made in the last 10 years is that Afghanistan most of the time has not been included in the regional framework to think on how to solve water issues. Look, for example, at most of the meetings which are organized in the region to talk about water issues. Afghanistan representatives actually most of the time were not invited. So, and Marlene actually very rightly mentioned that there is no water stress in Central Asia. But the future development of agriculture in Afghanistan will obviously have an impact on water flows in Central Asia. So my first question is, have you seen some recent assessments on Afghanistan's role and impact on water in post-Soviet Central Asia? Do you have the feeling that Afghanistan has been taken a little bit more into account these last 2 years than it was, for example, 10 years ago? And my second question is that as Marlene actually also mentioned, there can be very big contradictions between food security and water management. And one of the raising questions is that with the development of middle classes in Central Asia, and especially in Kazakhstan, this would increase a lot the consumption of meat in the years to come. And well, I can't remember the figures now, but breeding needs much more water than any other forms of agriculture, and could have a very strong impact on water sharing in the region. So I'm wondering to what extent this issue is taken into account in the debates on water issues in Central Asia by local, regional, and international organizations dealing with water issues, but also by actually foreign countries like the US, which are involved in these discussions. Thank you.
And I think we had two more, yeah. Three more, okay. Start down here.
Hi, I'm sorry I walked in late. I know I've missed a lot. My name is Dr. Mindy Reiser. I'm Vice President of an NGO called Global Peace Services. We work on peace building and conflict resolution, and we have an initiative looking at the role engineers can play in peace building and conflict resolution, which leads to my question. There are a number of new initiatives in higher education in Central Asia. Nazarbayev University is one, the University of Central Asia, and so on. So I'm wondering if there are not opportunities to involve young women who are going into engineering to look at some of the issues that were very well addressed. And certainly the engineering profession is changing. There are initiatives in Canada and elsewhere in the world to really sensitize engineers to some of the issues. So things are not all that bleak.
Here, and then we'll get you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Rahat Jabin. I'm from Pakistan. My question is with the DIPA regarding the West Water Treaty. She is very well, you have a very well elaborated about the treaty, how it works properly. But keeping in view the current situation in South Asia, particularly in India and Pakistan, the climatic, extreme climatic events like flooding and this kind of water scarcity in certain levels. So the treaty, I think, maybe need to revise or modify to include more options from both countries to how to face the challenges in disaster events like flooding and these kind of things. And I think there are other, beside this Indus Water Treaty, there are other issues among the two countries, like the Siachen glaciers. There is still a war going on over there, but they are still a very good water storage over there in the form of the glaciers. As far as I just refer the presentation by Marcus, that he mentioned about very good point out very good things like the ecosystem sustainability or environmental management. So is there a possibility in the policy level as far as the this Siachen glacier, can we declare a peace park or water park from Indian side and Pakistan sides to minimize their efforts instead of they have giving war continue on it. So I think maybe in she mentioned about this question that including the engineer. My question is, why don't we have including when there is a policy dialogues regarding these resources to include some scientists, researchers, environmentalists. They can create the importance of the environment as far as for the border, because both countries are facing the same problems.
We have one more question back here in the back.
I'm Marinda Miles, Department of Anthropology. I kind of going along with what Sebastian said, I'm wondering why Afghanistan and Iran aren't more integrated into the water discussions in the region. And between 2009 and 2013, there were 9 major international incidents over water problems in Afghanistan. 9 of them were because of Iran, 1 had to do with Pakistan. And Iran has a huge drought right now, and I think they're trying to get water from both Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and I'm wondering why that's not integrated into the system better.
All right, so we'll try to answer as brief as possible, because we know we don't want to keep a conference, between a conference and coffee, and a coffee break's a good opportunity to discuss these things in more depth, so.
Thanks. I'll try to give an answer that both responds to a couple of the other presentations and also it rolls up two of the questions that were addressed to me. And I would say I pushed back a little bit on the statement, and you'll see why, that Central Asia is not experiencing water stress. Because the way that I use water, there's been some new work. So the WRI aqueduct and also the fifth assessment report by the IPCC 2013 does show that there is the scarcity issue, but one of the aspects of the definition that I was using for water stress was availability. And by availability, what they really mean is the social transaction cost for time, distance, and money. So I heard a lot of discussion about how women do need to retrieve water. It's not as accessible, but also with the distance and money, that really speaks to governance, because it's not being made affordable or accessible in the governance structures of some of these countries. So speaking, I guess, how that might relate to Afghanistan, is there really isn't the governance ability within Afghanistan to have a comprehensive water policy to then speak about integration even across borders, using that dimension.
Okay, on the question of including Afghanistan and Iran. So Afghanistan is included in the treaty sharing the Amuraya, because that was a treaty signed between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. So Afghanistan has a very small share, I think it's 6% of the Amuraya part. The problem is that at the collapse of the Soviet Union, the other Central Asian countries divided the share of the Soviet Union, but they all refused. The 5 Central Asian countries refused to renegotiate the share of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is unfortunately left with a very limited part, which is of course becoming a problem, because the more northern Afghanistan is developing in terms of agriculture, the more they will be functioning water, and therefore it will be impacting the Central Asian countries. Moreover, it would mean that if northern Afghanistan would be interested in, for example, having an hydroelectricity project without having the agreement of the Central Asian state downstream, that will also create new tensions. But the Central Asian states are themselves responsible for not accepting to go back at the table of discussion with Afghanistan on that. Iran should be indeed part of the general discussion, but the problem is that all this water discussion, they are done by basin, and in fact Iran is not part of the Aral Sea basin, therefore it's not really part of the Central Asia discussion. It should be including on the kind of more the South Asian side, because depending on which river it is based, so it's not really connected to the Amuraya or the Siraya part. On the consumption of meat putting pressure on the water, that's true. I'm not sure there have been any kind of studies showing this specifically it's impacting Central Asia. I think it's a global phenomenon, but I don't know if we have studies showing how it would impact agricultural production in Kazakhstan especially. And on involving women in engineering professions in the new universities of Central Asia, that would be great. Unfortunately, even if you have goodwill on the side of the Aga Khan Foundation, for example, or the big donors of these new universities, they cannot really go against the general trend, which is that of retraditionalization of the role of women, especially in Tajikistan. So globally, all the Central Asian countries, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, lost a large part of their engineering tradition, because the new states didn't invest in creating new engineers or technical professions. So that already collapsed, and that will be very difficult to revive. And especially in Tajikistan, the status of women is really kind of deteriorating, and then for accessing to higher education is becoming more and more difficult, and in technical disciplines it's almost impossible. So there will be lower and lower, unfortunately the level of their involvement will probably remain low, and you can always have some specific case where this new university will be able to involve some of them, but that will be very difficult to make that a general trend, because you cannot go against the general trend of the society, which is to invite women not to be anymore on the job market. And that's the reality in Tajikistan largely, and in southern part of Kyrgyzstan also.
First on the question of South Asia model for Central Asia, I think each region, of course, has its own specificities, so you can't exactly transfer one to the other. However, I think that two types of models come out of South Asia, which also shows that there is no one single, there are many ways of doing this. One is the Indus Water Treaty, which was a multilateral treaty in the sense that you had the World Bank down the road that was very important in being a broker to get these two countries together at the time. Also, there was a lot of money that was funneled into both India and Pakistan by the World Bank. The US was also, at that time, a sort of soft partner in that. That's one. So a bigger, some outside third party could be a useful role. But the second one, which is the India-Bangladesh, is bilateral. It was purely India and Bangladesh, but the people-to-people track-to diplomacy work that went into preparing a final agreement, I think was very, very important. So you had stakeholders on both sides that took several years to put that into place. Now the new Silk Road initiative that the Blumenthal talked about, I think perhaps that's one way in which it could be folded in the Central Asia possible agreements. Future agreements could be folded into something like that. At least it's a venue for discussion. As far as the renegotiating the Indus Water Treaty, you're right. I was trying to look at some of the successes of it, and there are pressures now to have a re-look at it. Especially the 50th anniversary was a good time to re-examine. And I think one of the things was that now, of course, things have changed, as Marcus pointed out. If you look into the 2030, 2050 period, there's another country that needs to be involved now, that's China. Because of the fact that all of those waters, Indus waters, come from the Tibetan Plateau. So then the question is, how do you bring China, especially because China is in the middle of the biggest dam building crusade right now. And so that is going to affect the water flow. And so that is one complicating factor, but it's something that has to be taken into account. So in this case, I think India and Pakistan will have to bring in China, and then of course there are issues between India and China that have to be ironed out. So it might be even more complicated, which means all the more reason to start talking about it now before it becomes worse.
Brahmaputra too, with China.
Brahmaputra, yes. Yes.
It needs to be sorted out.
There are about 6 rivers that flow through. Indus is the one most important between India and Pakistan, but you're absolutely right. And that completely goes into Bangladesh as well. China is the key. And finally, the Siachen Glacier, I completely agree with you. I think, first of all, it is not looked at as a environmental issue or climate change issue, but it can change the terms of reference and discourse if you did do that. And one final point is that it's one of the highest battlefields in the world. More people up there, more soldiers die of hypothermia and frostbite and everything than actual battle. It's ridiculous. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to encourage people to catch the speakers over coffee to discuss more. But thank you very much.